She'd been standing in the rain for 2 hours before anyone thought to cut her loose. The rope around her wrists was not the worst of it. The worst was the silence of the crowd that had gathered to watch and done nothing. This is not a story about a man who rescued a woman. It is a story about two people who were both already broken and what happened when one of them finally decided that broken did not mean finished. The rope bit into her wrists through the wet wool of her sleeves, and Nora Callahan had stopped pulling against it sometime in the first hour. Not because she had given up. Because she had learned, a long time before this particular humiliation, that fighting a rope in public only made the watching more satisfying for the people who had tied it. Welcome to Dusty Vows. If this is your first time here, subscribe now and stay with her. She earned this. The post was at the edge of the Caldwell Town Square, outside the land office, where Harlan Pruitt had marched her when she refused to sign the transfer deed on her late husband's homestead. She had refused in the office. He had called her hysterical. She had repeated her refusal, calmly, with the deed number and statute citation from memory, and Pruitt had grabbed her elbow, walked her outside into the October rain, and tied her to the hitching post like a horse that needed minding. He told the small crowd she was disturbed, that her grief had turned her mind, that he was protecting the town from a woman who did not understand her situation. Nora understood her situation precisely. Her husband, Thomas, had died in August, owing Pruitt $140, and Pruitt wanted the land to cover it. But the homestead deed was in Nora's name, had been since the day Thomas filed it, because Thomas had been smarter than people gave him credit for and had loved her more than Pruitt calculated. The deed was hers. The debt was not. She had the paperwork to prove both. Pruitt knew this. That was why she was tied to a post in the rain instead of sitting across a desk signing her life away. She had 7 days. The county clerk, Mr. Folsom, a thin, nervous man, had told her quietly last week that Pruitt had filed a fraudulent lien using Thomas's name, and if she did not contest it before the circuit judge arrived on the 14th, the lien would convert to a forced sale. Today was the 7th. The judge arrived tomorrow morning. She had come to file the contest herself. She had the original deed, statute pages copied by hand in the Caldwell Library, and a signed affidavit from Folsom. She had everything she needed, except her hands were tied to a post. The rain had gone from drizzle to a steady cold curtain. The crowd had mostly dispersed. The entertainment had cooled with the temperature. She stood straight. Her back ached. Her wool coat was soaked through and the cold had moved deeper, but she kept her chin level and eyes forward and did not cry, because Pruitt was watching from the land office window and she would not give him that. She heard the horse before she saw the rider. A big gray, trotting down the main road, the rider not hurrying but not wasting motion. He pulled up short at the square, and she felt him take in the scene, the post, the rope, the woman alone in the rain. He dismounted without speaking. Tall and broad through the shoulder, wearing a canvas duster dark with rain along the seams. His face was weathered from years looking at hard country, not old, perhaps 35, but difficult to age precisely. His jaw was set. His eyes, when they reached hers, were pale, almost colorless gray, holding neither pity nor amusement. He looked at the rope, her wrists, the land office window where Pruitt's silhouette stood watching. He pulled a folding knife from his belt, opened it, and cut the rope in one motion. "You're free now," he said. It was not tender, not an announcement, a simple statement of fact, the way a man might say the gate is open or the water is deep. Nora registered the absence of ceremony and found it, unexpectedly, more dignified than anything else that had happened that day. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. She unwound the rope from her wrists herself, dropped it in the mud, and looked at the land office door. "You going in there?" he said. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment, then walked with her to the door. She did not ask him to. He did not explain himself. He simply walked beside her, and when she pushed the door open and stepped inside, he stepped in behind her. Harlan Pruitt, reaching for the door latch from the inside, perhaps to lock it, saw the man behind her and went very still. "Calloway," Pruitt said. "Not a greeting. A recognition with weight." The man behind her said nothing. Nora walked to the counter, laid her folder flat on the wood, and looked at Mr. Folsom, who had gone the color of old paste. "I am here to file a formal contest to the fraudulent lien on the Callahan homestead, Parcel 14, Section 3, she said. "I have the original deed, a copy of the relevant statute, and a signed affidavit. I would like to file before close of business today so the contest is on record before the circuit judge arrives tomorrow." Folsom looked from her to Pruitt. Pruitt looked at the man called Calloway. Calloway was looking at the wall behind Pruitt's head with the patient expression of a man who had all afternoon and no particular feeling about how it went. Folsom took the documents. The door closed behind her an hour later with the contest properly filed, the affidavit witnessed, and a receipt in her coat pocket. The rain had eased to mist. The gray horse was still at the rail, and Calloway was leaning against the post she had been tied to 20 minutes ago, arms crossed, watching the road. He did not look at her when she came down the steps. "You knew him," she said. "Pruitt." "Yes." "He looked afraid of you. Men like Pruitt are afraid of anyone who doesn't need them." He pushed off the post and gathered the gray's reins. "You got somewhere to go tonight?" She had the homestead. 5 miles out of town, the road would be mud now, and she had come in on foot because she could not afford the livery on top of everything else. 40 cents in her coat pocket, a half-full larder, and a cold fireplace waiting. "Yes," she said. He looked at her then, a flat, assessing look she recognized from ledger work, the look of a man adding a column and not liking the sum. "The Callahan homestead," he said. "Parcel 14. She went still. "You know it. It borders my land to the north." He was quiet for a moment. "Thomas Callahan's widow. Nora Callahan." He nodded once, then said, "I've got a wagon at the livery. I'll take you out." It was not a question. She wanted to refuse on principle, but principle was a luxury wearing thin since August, and it was 5 miles in the mud and getting dark. "All right," she said. He went to get the wagon. His name was Eli Calloway, and she learned it not from him but from the liveryman, who called him by name when he paid and then glanced at Nora with the expression suggesting this was noteworthy, Eli Calloway doing anything for anyone other than himself. The ride out was silent. The road was mud as expected, and the last daylight was going amber at the horizon by the time the homestead came into view. Small. Neat, still, because she kept it neat. The garden was past, but the fences were sound. She'd painted the door herself in June, dark red that had faded to rose. He pulled the wagon up and she climbed down before he could consider offering a hand, which he had shown no indication of doing. "I would invite you in," she said, "but I have nothing to offer." He looked at the house, then at the fence line running north toward the gray-green hills where his land presumably began. "Pruitt won't stop at the lien," he said. "Filing the contest buys you time. It doesn't end it." She knew this. "He's been after 3 properties on this road for 2 years, Calloway went on. "Mine is one of them. He gets your land. He controls the water access to my northern pasture, so that was why he was in town. Not rescue, self-interest." She found this more reassuring than altruism would have been. "What are you proposing?" she said. He looked at her directly. Those colorless eyes held something that was not quite a question, something more like a calculation that had already reached its answer. "A legal arrangement," he said. "You keep the homestead. It becomes part of my property on paper, which means Pruitt loses his legal angle, because he can't touch land that's already transferred inside a marriage record. You stay. You keep the deed. He loses his claim." The word marriage landed like a stone in still water, and she watched the rings move outward. "You're speaking of a legal marriage," she said, precisely. "I'm speaking of a legal arrangement." He said it as if the distinction meant something to him. "My foreman and his wife need the main house. I have a second structure on the north property. You would have your own house, your own land, recorded in the deed as a parcel of the Calloway Ranch. Pruitt cannot touch it. When the arrangement no longer serves, it can be dissolved by mutual agreement." She thought of the receipt in her pocket. Tomorrow's judge. What Pruitt would do after the judge ruled and left and the town went back to watching from a comfortable distance. "I would need my name on the deed," she said. "Already said that. I would need my own room, my own hours. Wasn't planning a courtship. I want it in writing." He almost nodded. "Almost. I'll have it drawn up tonight." "Then I'll give you my answer in the morning," she said, and turned and went inside before he could respond, because she had learned that with certain kinds of men, the last word mattered. She stood in the dark kitchen with her hand on the iron of the cold stove and listened to the wagon pull away, thinking about what she was actually considering, and decided that she had faced worse decisions in worse circumstances and had survived all of them. In the morning, she said yes. The second structure on the north property was not the rough outbuilding she had feared. A small but sound two-room cabin set back from the main ranch road by cottonwoods that had gone gold with October. It had a good iron stove, a solid door, and a window facing east. She stood in the center on her first morning and let the early light come in and decided it would do. The wedding, if it could be called that, took place in the county clerk's office with Folsom as witness and a circuit preacher who smelled of pipe tobacco and asked no personal questions. Eli Calloway said the necessary words in the same tone he would have used to state a price. Nora said them in the same tone she would have used to confirm a receipt. They signed the register. Folsom looked briefly as if he might say something warm, and then thought better of it. Eli drove her to the ranch in the same silence he had used on every previous occasion. She sat with her small trunk in the wagon bed and watched the plains open wide on either side, thinking about Thomas, the homestead, and the distance between where she had imagined her life going and where it had actually arrived. The ranch hands, 4 of them, weathered and quiet, looked at her with expressions ranging from neutral to uncertain. The foreman, a broad man named Walt, touched his hat brim. His wife, May, came out from the main house and shook Nora's hand with a grip like a good handshake should have and said, "I'll show you the kitchen stores when you're ready," which was more welcome than Nora had expected. Eli showed her the cabin. He stood in the doorway while she set her trunk down and looked at the space. "Wood stacked on the north side," he said. "Water from the well by the barn. You'll hear the bell for supper if you want to eat in the main house. May cooks for the hands. I can cook for myself." He looked at the iron stove. "Suit yourself, Mr. Calloway." She turned to face him. "What do you need from me?" "In practical terms," he was quiet for a moment, "the ranch books are a disaster. My last foreman kept them. He's gone. I've got a cattle sale in 6 weeks, and I can't tell you honestly what I owe against what's coming in. I can read a ledger." "I know." He said it flatly, but there was something under it. Acknowledgement, maybe. The recognition that he had not married a woman who didn't know what she was doing. "The books are in the main house office. Use them as you need." He left. She unpacked her trunk, built a fire in the stove, and sat down with her hands in her lap and breathed for the first time in 2 months without the weight of imminent ruin pressing on her sternum. Then she got up and went to find the ledger books. For 3 days, Nora barely saw Eli. She spent her time buried in the ranch ledgers, uncovering a slow financial collapse hidden beneath years of neglected bookkeeping. Then she found something worse. A receipt signed by Harlan Pruitt showed Eli had already paid off a loan tied to the North Pasture water rights. But after digging through the original land grants, Nora realized the loan itself had been fraudulent. Pruitt never legally owned those rights to begin with. He had swindled Eli, just as he had tried to swindle her. On the 4th morning, another problem struck. One of the ranch heifers was struggling to breathe. Nora rushed to the barn with the medical kit she had carried since her homestead days, already knowing exactly what needed to be done. She was crouched in the straw with the heifer's head in her lap, working carefully when she heard boots on the barn floor and looked up to find Eli standing 6 feet away. He had clearly come to deal with the animal himself. He had a different look than usual, not the flat, controlled expression of the yard and office, but something more alert. He looked at the heifer, at Nora's hands, at the kit laid open beside her with the tools arranged in the order she'd used them. She had already cleared the blockage. The heifer's breathing had eased 10 minutes ago. The animal was calm. She was choking on a feed obstruction, Nora said, without particular drama. "I've cleared it. Her breathing should be normal by this evening. Keep her off the dry feed for 2 days. Eli stood there. She began cleaning the tools. The straw was warm and smelled of animal heat and the cold coming in under the barn door, and she was aware of him watching her with attention he hadn't had before, different from the cool appraisal of the office. Something recalibrating. "You've done that before," he said, "several times." She set the last tool in its place and closed the kit. Thomas's ranch was too far from a veterinarian to wait on one. He crouched down beside her, not close, but closer than their previous conversations had placed him, and laid a hand on the heifer's flank. The animal didn't flinch. "I would have lost her," he said. "It was not gratitude, exactly. It was an honest accounting, you might have." She stood. "I found the Pruitt receipt in the desk, the loan payment on the north pasture, 14 months ago." He rose as well, and the alertness in his face shifted to something sharper. "That loan was legitimate," he said. "The payment was legitimate. The loan was not. Pruitt had no legal standing to hold a claim against water rights he didn't own. The original grant is in your deed files under the 79 survey." She looked at him steadily. "He took your money, Mr. Calloway, and he is likely attempting the same construction on 4 other properties in this county." The silence that followed was not empty. He was doing what she had done, following the line of it out to its logical end. This is Dusty Vows, where stories like hers live. Women who walked in with nothing but what they knew, and men who weren't ready for what they were about to learn. If you want the next story the moment it arrives, subscribe now. Then, back to the ranch. "That makes him a swindler operating across county lines," Eli said. "It makes him a man who has been doing this long enough to be careful and confident. He will have covered what he can. But the original grant document is dated and witnessed, and your payment receipt is signed in his own hand." She picked up the medical kit. "If the circuit judge is still in Caldwell, you might want to be there before he leaves." He looked at her for a moment with that recalibrating attention. "I didn't ask you to go through those books," he said. "No," she agreed. "You didn't." She walked past him toward the barn door. The cold morning air hit her face as she stepped out, sharp and clean, and behind her she heard him follow, and then stop, and she did not look back. That afternoon, he rode to Caldwell. She knew it from the sound of the gray leaving the yard at a pace that meant purpose. She went back to the office and spent 3 hours writing up a clean summary of the Pruitt ledger irregularities in her clearest hand, with relevant document references noted in the margins, because if he was going to stand in front of a judge, he should not be standing there with a pile of loose papers and his own anger. She left the summary on the desk. When he returned that evening, the main house lamp was lit and she was in her cabin with the fire going and a book open in her lap, and she heard the gray come into the yard and heard him stop, and heard, through the quiet, the sound of the office door open and close. Walt came to her door an hour later. He stood on the step with his hat in his hands and said, "He asked me to tell you supper's in the main house tonight, if you want it." She went. The kitchen was warm and smelled of maize cornbread and wood smoke, and the 4 ranch hands ate in their usual working silence, and Eli sat at the head of the table and said nothing through most of the meal. May served and watched the room with the steady, containing attention of a woman who has managed men all her working life. Near the end of the meal, Eli said, without preamble, "The judge has the Pruitt filing. He's holding session tomorrow morning." He looked down the table at no one in particular. All 3 fraudulent loans, 9 properties. Walt let out a long breath. "Nora found the grant document," Eli said, and he said her name, her first name, her given name, with the same plain tonelessness he used for everything, and yet the table registered something, a slight shift. May's eyes moving briefly to Nora's face, Walt's hands going still on his cup. Nora kept her own face still and reached for the bread. By the end of the second week, she had reorganized the ranch books into 3 ledgers, operational costs, outstanding debt, and projected cattle revenue, and had drafted a repayment schedule for the bank loan that would clear it in 14 months instead of the current floating arrangement costing them in interest. She left it on the office desk with a note explaining her reasoning. The next morning, Nora found a short note from Eli beside the ledgers. "Keep going." She almost smiled. Soon she began eating in the main house kitchen, where silence between them no longer felt awkward. It became the quiet comfort of 2 people slowly learning each other. One afternoon, Bess Hartley arrived with apples and quickly decided Nora was sharper than Eli deserved. Eli simply replied, "Probably," earning a knowing look from Bess across the table. Days later, the judge officially voided all 9 of Pruitt's fraudulent land claims. Relief spread across the county. But Nora knew men like Pruitt rarely accepted defeat quietly. So when she saw him riding toward her cabin one evening while Eli was away, she didn't panic. She calmly reached for the envelope she had already prepared, evidence strong enough to destroy him if he pushed further. She heard him on the step, and heard the knock and said clearly, "Go away, Mr. Pruitt." "You stole from me," he said through the door. "That land was payment against a legitimate debt. The judge disagrees. In writing. Judges come and go. Land stays." His voice had the particular quality of a man accustomed to people behind doors eventually opening them. "Your husband owed me. That debt doesn't die with him just because you hired yourself a protector." "I did not hire anyone." She kept her voice level. "And the debt you're referring to was calculated against a fraudulent instrument, which the county records now reflect. You are trespassing on Calloway property." The pause that followed had a quality she didn't like. "Calloway's not here," Pruitt said. She heard the step creak. She heard the latch. Nora pressed her hand against the cabin door. "I have enough evidence in this envelope to put you before a territorial judge," she warned Pruitt. "Open this door, and I'll add tonight to the charges." Silence followed. Then his footsteps retreated. Moments later, another horse arrived at a gallop. Eli stepped inside, breath sharp from the hard ride, his coat damp with sweat and rain. "He's gone," he said. Nora lifted the envelope. "I was ready for him." Eli studied her quietly, something deeper than surprise crossing his face. "You didn't wait for me," he said. "I didn't need to." He stood in the doorway a moment longer, then said, "You should have told me about the envelope. I told you about the ledger irregularities. I told you about the grant document. I told you about the payment receipt." She set the envelope on the desk. "Did you think I would stop preparing?" He almost said something. She saw it, the slight movement in his jaw, the breath drawn to carry words, the decision not to use them. He turned and pulled the cabin door closed from the outside. She heard him cross the yard. She heard Walt's voice and Eli's answering it, and then quiet. She sat down at the desk and pressed her palms flat against the wood and thought about Thomas, who had known her, who had seen what she was capable of and had loved her for it. And she thought about this man who had married her for land and water rights and had received something considerably more complicated. And she thought about what it meant that she was sitting in a warm cabin on a solvent ranch with a signed deed and a clear conscience. And that it was not rescue, but it was also not nothing. The next morning the frost came down hard, the first real frost of the season, and the yard was silver gray when she came out before dawn to start the kitchen fire. May wasn't up yet. The ranch was still. The cold was absolute and clean and smelled of ice and distance. She was at the kitchen stove when she heard him come in. He stood at the kitchen door in the half-dark and said, "I went back to Caldwell yesterday, after Pruitt." A pause. Talked to the county attorney. Gave him the copy of the payment receipt and the grant document. "Pruitt will be charged." Another pause. "He told me you had already sent him a copy last week." She fed wood into the stove. "I didn't want to depend on the judge's ruling being enough," she said. She had stood in the rain for 2 hours before anyone cut her loose. The rope around Nora Callahan's wrists hurt less than the silence of the crowd watching her suffer. Harlan Pruitt had tied her to a post outside the Caldwell land office after she refused to sign away her late husband's homestead. He called her unstable. The truth was simpler. The land legally belonged to Nora, and Pruitt wanted it badly enough to humiliate her in public. Then a stranger arrived. Tall, quiet, weathered by hard country, Eli Calloway dismounted from his gray horse, cut the rope from her wrists, and said only, "You're free now. No speeches, no pity." He walked beside her into the land office while Pruitt watched in silence, suddenly far less confident. Nora filed her legal contest against the fraudulent lien on her property before the circuit judge could arrive. Outside afterward, Eli revealed he knew her land well. It bordered his own ranch. Pruitt wanted both properties because controlling them meant controlling the water access nearby. So Eli proposed something practical: a legal marriage. On paper, Nora's homestead would become tied to the Calloway ranch, making it nearly impossible for Pruitt to seize. Nora demanded terms, her name on the deed, her own space, everything in writing. Eli agreed without argument. The marriage was quiet, businesslike, almost emotionless. But once she moved to the ranch, Nora discovered Eli's finances were collapsing. The ranch books were a disaster. Loans were piling up. So she reorganized everything herself, uncovering evidence that Pruitt had been swindling ranchers across the county through fraudulent land claims. Then, she saved one of Eli's heifers from choking in the barn before he arrived to help. That was the first moment he truly looked at her differently. Not as a legal arrangement, as someone capable. Together they built a case against Pruitt. Nora organized the evidence, documented the fraud, and prepared legal papers strong enough to destroy him. When the circuit judge finally reviewed the records, 9 fraudulent property liens were overturned. But Pruitt still wasn't finished. One evening, he came to Nora's cabin while Eli was away, trying to intimidate her into surrendering the land. Instead of panicking, Nora stood at the door holding an envelope filled with evidence already prepared for the territorial marshal. "If you open this door," she warned him, "I'll have even more to add to the case." Pruitt backed down. When Eli returned and learned she had already prepared everything without depending on him, something shifted completely inside him. He realized she had never needed rescuing. She had only needed time and room to fight her own battle. The next morning, standing together in the ranch kitchen before sunrise, Eli admitted the arrangement no longer felt like an arrangement. "I'm better at this ranch with you in it," he told her quietly. Nora answered honestly, "I don't intend to stop being exactly what I am." "I know," he said. "I stopped thinking that was inconvenient a long time ago." That evening at supper, Nora finally agreed to stay for reasons that had nothing to do with land or legal protection. Eli reached across the table, placed his rough hand gently over hers, and this time, she turned her hand over and held on. Not because she had been saved, because someone had finally understood her strength without trying to take it away. She thought of his first look at her, that ledger-summing look. She thought of the heifer and the envelope, and her name in his mouth at the kitchen table, and the way he had ridden back from Caldwell last night with urgency he had not bothered to conceal. "You should know," she said, "that I don't intend to stop being exactly what I am. I know that." Something moved in his face, something that was almost not a smile, but the structural possibility of one. I stopped thinking of it as inconvenient sometime around the third ledger. She turned back to the stove because she needed a moment, and because some things were better done without an audience, even when the audience was only one. "I'll think about it," she said. She heard him step back from the kitchen. She heard him pause at the door. Nora, the third time. Her name in his mouth like something he had decided to keep. She did not turn. "Thank you. For the books. For Pruitt. For the heifer. A brief quiet. For not leaving when the cabin was cold. He left." She stood at the iron stove with her hand on the warm metal and the frost still silver on the window glass, and the ranch coming alive outside in the ordinary sounds of morning, boots and horses, and Walt calling something to the youngest hand. And she understood, without theatrics or announcement, that she had made her decision some time ago and had simply been waiting for him to catch up. She let him have until evening. At supper, she sat across from him at the kitchen table, and when May set the bread down and went back to the stove, Nora looked at Eli Calloway and said, "All right." He looked up from his plate. She held his look. He set his fork down and reached across the table and put his hand over hers, palm down, without performance, without a word. His hand was warm and rough from the work of the land, and it rested on hers with the steady weight of something that had decided to stay. She turned her hand over and let it. Outside, the frost was still on the ground, and the sky had gone the deep clear black of a cold season night, and the ranch was quiet around them, and that was all. She walked into that arrangement with nothing but a deed in her own name and the patience to outlast a man who underestimated her. He walked out of it knowing what he had almost lost twice, the land once and her once, and that the second would have been worse. "Tell me, if you had been tied to that post in the rain, would you have opened the door for Pruitt, or would you have held it? Leave your answer in the comments below. I read everyone. Next week, a woman named Josephine steps off a stagecoach in Broken Creek carrying a letter of introduction for a man who died 6 months ago. And the ranch his nephew inherited has exactly 1 season left before the bank takes it. Subscribe to Dusty Vows now, so you are here when she arrives.